Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into K. Redfield Jamison's incredible book, Touched with Fire, to explore a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty controversial idea: the deep and often tragic link between creative genius and what we used to call madness.
You know, this idea of the mad genius has been around forever, right? The artist who's possessed by some kind of chaotic, maybe even divine inner force. We see it in movies. We read about it in books. It's just part of our culture.
So is this just a cool story we tell ourselves, or is there something real, something clinical going on? Well, that's where Jamison's work gets so interesting. She goes way beyond the myth to build a scientific and biographical case for a real link between artists and a very specific illness. So yeah, let's dive into it, starting with the illness itself.
Okay, before we can even get to the art part, we really need to understand what we're talking about here. Jamison isn't talking about artists just being a little quirky or, moody.
The illness is manic depressive illness, or what most of us today call bipolar disorder. And look, this is not just being moody. It's a whole spectrum, from milder forms with big but maybe not totally debilitating mood swings, all the way to severe, life-threatening psychotic episodes.
And this is where it gets so wild, right? You're looking at two completely opposite worlds, all happening inside one person's head. On one side, you've got mania. Moods are high, energy is through the roof, thoughts are racing a mile a minute. And on the other side, it's a world of black and gray. Just total apathy, slowed thinking, and a kind of hopelessness that's hard to imagine. It's that violent swing between these two poles that really defines the illness.
So you'd think, okay, depression, that's obviously got to be a creativity killer, right? But here's the twist. Jamison argues that the other side, the manic side, especially in its milder forms, called hypomania, can actually be the engine that fuels the creative process. So how does that work?
Well, check this out. These things on the list, they aren't just random symptoms. A psychologist named J.P. Guilford actually identified these very traits as the core building blocks of creative thinking. When you're in that state, your mind isn't so focused on one single goal. It's free to wander, to explore, to make all these unique and original connections that it normally wouldn't.
And just listen to how Edgar Allan Poe puts it. He's giving us a peek right inside his own head. He calls it a mania for composition that just takes over. He even calls these bursts of insane energy a disease. But, and this is a really big but, that's only half the picture.
So this next part might sound a little weird, a little counterintuitive. Jamison's research shows that the depressive phase, it's not just some awful obstacle you have to get through. In many cases, it's actually essential to creating art.
Okay, so think of it like this. Mania is like a wild, chaotic brainstorming session. Ideas are flying everywhere, it's brilliant, but it's a total mess. And then depression comes in, and it's the editor. It's the force that slows everything down, cuts out all the excess, and brings a kind of sharp, sobering focus to all that chaos, shaping it into a finished piece of art.
You know, the poet T.S. Eliot had this famous line, "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." He was basically saying that most of us, well, we put up these little walls to protect ourselves from the really hard truths of life.
But Virginia Woolf, who knew this illness all too well, she saw it completely differently. For her, depression wasn't a wall, it was the thing that smashed the wall down. It's this brutal plunge where you're forced to confront a reality that's painful, yes, but maybe more profound. A reality you can then turn into art.
But, and this is so important, we can't romanticize this. This symbiotic relationship between the illness and the art, it comes at an absolutely staggering human cost.
Just take a second and really let this sink in. We're talking about a mortality rate for untreated bipolar disorder that's higher than for many kinds of heart disease or cancer. And the main reason for that is suicide. This is not some beautiful tragedy. It's a lethal illness that causes a level of anguish that it's almost impossible to comprehend.
The good news, thankfully, is that this is treatable. There are medications like lithium that can manage these huge, devastating swings. They can alleviate an incredible amount of suffering and, quite literally, save lives.
And that leads us to this incredibly difficult, profound dilemma that so many artists have had to face themselves. If you treat the illness, if you manage those swings, do you also put out the very fire that fuels the art?
The painter Edvard Munch, he captured this fear perfectly. A lot of artists worry that treatment will just flatten their emotional world, that it'll turn them into these, normal, well-adjusted, bloodless souls who just don't have anything left to say or create.
They're afraid of losing the very thing that makes them who they are.
And that's really the central, unanswered question that Touch with Fire leaves us all hanging with. It's a deeply uncomfortable question about what creativity is, about the price of suffering, and what it even means to be cured. It forces us to ask what we value more, the well-being of the artist or the art that their anguish might just produce.